Welcome to this episode of Wiki Walks, a short podcast devoted to some of the more intriguing and, who knew, articles that you can run across in the weird world of Wikipedia. I'm your host, Chris Grismer. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, this is going to be a long one. And on a guy that you've never, ever heard of, but he did something very important, along with a few other of his friends. Like we've had in the past, this touches on some more adult topics, but I'll try to keep it light. Despite there being over 80 of founding fathers to the United States, most of us can really only name a famous handful. And considering how we enjoy the more outrageous stories of womanizing and booze parties, it's kind of strange that the name Gouverneur Morris doesn't come up more often. Nicknamed the Penman of the Constitution, not only did Morris substantially contribute to the founding of America, but he did so while living a life of public romance, we'll call it, seedy affairs, and vengeful dismemberment. Interested yet? Woo! All right, let's take a closer look at the most underrated wild man of the American Revolution. Having grown up in the Bronx, Morris first worked for the New York Revolutionary government before becoming one of the youngest members to serve in the Continental Congress. While there, he spearheaded multiple committees and became close with, well, you guessed it, George Washington, a man he would go on to support for many years to come. Morris wasn't nicknamed the Penman of the Constitution for nothing. The title was quite literal on account of him writing the United States preamble. He coined key phrases like, "We the people of the United States." That's him. He wrote that. That's his line. During the Constitutional Convention at Independence Hall, Morris held the distinction of addressing the crowd more than any other delegate, with a whopping 173 speeches. Whoa! In a time where some of the most influential men owned thousands of slaves, it might be surprising to hear how adamantly Gouverneur Morris hated the practice. In a speech before the Constitutional Convention in 1787 titled "The Curse of Slavery," Morris referred to the act as a nefarious institution that, in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages. Whoa! Along with pointing out its unfathomable cruelty, Morris correctly foresaw the rift such an institution would create in the country, essentially predicting the inevitable civil war to follow. I want you to picture some swanky music playing in your head because this founding father was not a stranger to knocking boots in public. And while some of you more adventurous types could possibly relate, we here at Wiki Walks don't judge. We're willing to bet your tales of overt romance don't involve getting busy at the Louvre. Ever done that one before? Put that on your bucket list. Before it was the famous art museum, the House of Mona Lisa was the house for the French king. One particular resident happened to be a married gal who was rather friendly with Gouverneur Morris. In one of his journal entries, Morris described a visit to his lady friend, saying, "We take the chance of interruption and celebrate in the passage while mademoiselle is at the harpsichord in the drawing room. The husband is below. Visitors are hourly expected. The doors are all open." While that might sound perfectly innocent, it takes a much different meaning if you note that Mr. Morris often used the word celebrate as code for, In other words, Morris celebrated with this French lady in the Louvre hallway, just to the sound of a harpsichord while her husband was mere feet away. And that's not the only record of this heroic and patriotic philanderer having celebration with betrothed gals. Unless you're doing it wrong, that act generally doesn't result in the loss of a limb. But being the pioneer that he was, however, Morris was up to the challenge. According to historian Dave Kimball in 1780, Morris was confronted by an irate husband, understandably, who caught them in celebrating times. And after a chase through the Philadelphia streets, I'm hoping Morris was adequately clothed at the time, Morris was accidentally struck by an oncoming carriage, resulting in the injury and amputation of his leg. Ugh. While losing a leg might dissuade the less stubborn, Morris continued his long life of celebration, so much so that fellow founding father John Jay once exclaimed that he wished Morris had in fact lost something else instead. But in 1809, this evil Knievel of womanizing finally decided to settle down. And at the age of 57, he announced his marriage to Anne Carey Randolph, who was his 34-year-old housekeeper at the time. Along with being, 22 years younger, Anne had caught fame from a previous celebration she had with a brother-in-law. The affair resulted in a baby that mysteriously perished soon after, which is regrettable, but accused of the child's murder, Anne and the suspected father were detained and eventually brought to trial. But after a particularly heated hearing, the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Apparently, none of this bothered Governor, and that's his name, by the way. He was not a governor. His name was Governor. And by all accounts, he spent the rest of his life happily married to the suspected infanticidal child bride. True love? Yeah, sure. Why not? Being a diplomat to France seemed like a pretty comfortable gig, provided it's not during that one period in time containing the most iconic act of civil unrest. But unfortunately for Morris, his time served as a minister plenipotentiary to France went from 1792 to 1794, which, if you took a history class, you might remember as the bloodiest years of the French Revolution. Man, this guy had timing, didn't he? Morris was often forced to face anti-aristocratic revolutionaries head-on, and according to historian Forrest MacDonald, was once forced to ward off a mob by literally thinking on his feet, or foot in this case. When riding in a quite ostentatious carriage, the distressed diplomat thrust his now wooden peg leg out of a window in order to baffle the oncoming mob, his cries of "Vive la Révolution!" confusing them enough to make a speedy getaway. That's right, he shook his peg leg out of a window to confuse them. Being strongly and ironically opposed to the revolution, Morris even attempted to rescue Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from their inevitable fate. Failing this, he did manage to rescue and ship their personal furniture to his home in the Bronx, including an intricately decorated armchair that originally resided at Versailles. Because, hey, if you can't save your aristocratic pals, that doesn't mean you can't enjoy their aristocratic comforts. In case you haven't realized it yet, Mr. Morris's first name, again, literally Governor. The denomination is the result of his mother's very unique maiden name, and Governor wasn't the only Morris to get chiseled into Revolutionary history, as his half-brother, Lewis Morris, also signed the Declaration of Independence. And if two Morrises seem plenty, the Declaration was also signed by personal but non-related friend, Robert Morris. Together, the Morris Triumvirate would help establish America's financial security, with Robert serving as the superintendent of finance during the Revolutionary War. Sadly, the fate of these two Morrises parted ways later in life when Robert lost his money and land and died in a state of poverty. Not exactly slumming it, the Morris family had once purchased 500 acres of land along the Harlem River. This land would go on to become the residence of our one-legged, lady-loving constitutional creator. Named for his family, the neighborhood of Morrisania would become the home to Morris's estate as it expanded to 2,000 acres. But you might know it better by its modern title of the South Bronx. This wasn't even close to the only influence the name Morris had on the city of New York, as Governor went on to play a big part in the layout of modern Manhattan. Just for starters, Morris was one of the earliest advocates for the Erie Canal. His efforts established the creation of the Western and Northern Inland Lock Navigation Companies in 1792, and then Morris would be appointed to a group tasked with reforming the entire layout of the city. The commission he led rejected the European influence of old, opting for a grid system containing 155 streets and 12 avenues. Anyone faintly familiar with the Big Apple will recognize this as the modern and extremely convenient system we have today, designed by our one-legged, peg-legged friend. You could say that Gouverneur Morris died the way that he lived, getting in trouble on account of what's, down in that area. Or, his leg, maybe, who knows. But in November of 1816, just when you thought this couldn't get any weirder, it gets exponentially weirder. Morris experienced trouble while urinating, which can happen as one gets older. He identified the problem as a blockage in his urethra. Historians would later diagnose this likely as prostate cancer, but to be more specific and unfortunately much more grotesque, Morris had a piece of whalebone handy that he attempted to, get in there and treat and try to remove the blockage. Just that, it was a different time. But this very painful game of self-operation led to internal injuries, infection, and inevitably the death of Gouverneur Morris. From a whalebone, there. For all his impact on the founding of America, the diaries of the French Revolution, and contributions to the way that New York is still arranged, it's almost comforting that Morris managed to stay weird and coitus crazed from the beginning to the very painful and uncomfortable end. So, that is the crazy, lurid, lewd body tales of Gouverneur Morris. Bet you didn't know that one, huh? He went from being a Yankee Doodle dandy to being a little too Yankee Doodle randy.